When Sarah Chen clocked in for her double shift at St. Mary's General Hospital that cold December morning, she had no idea that her simple act of human decency would cost her everything she'd worked for. What happened next defied all logic and changed not just her life, but the entire American healthcare system. This is a story about courage, compassion, and how sometimes doing the right thing leads to consequences nobody could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's General Hospital hummed with the relentless energy of a place that never slept. Sarah Chen pushed through the heavy emergency room doors, her scrubs already wrinkled from the bus ride across Phoenix. The familiar smell of antiseptic and industrial coffee hit her immediately, mixing with the underlying tension that always seemed to hang in the air of an understaffed public hospital. At 28, Sarah had learned to read the mood of the emergency room within seconds of arrival. Tonight felt different, charged with the kind of electricity that usually meant trouble was brewing. The waiting room stretched before her like a scene from urban purgatory. Plastic chairs held a collection of Phoenix's forgotten people. Construction. Workers nursing injured hands, elderly patients clutching prescription bottles, mothers bouncing crying infants, and teenagers with suspicious wounds they claimed came from accidents. The overhead television played mindless morning shows to an audience too tired or too sick to care. Sarah's worn sneakers squeaked against the linoleum as she made her way to the nurses' station, where Kelly Williams was already deep in conversation with Dr. Amanda Foster about bed shortages and staffing issues. Kelly looked up as Sarah approached, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The night shift had clearly been brutal, evidenced by the coffee stains on Kelly's uniform and the dark circles under her eyes. St. Mary's had been operating on skeleton crews for months, ever since the latest round of budget cuts had forced the administration to choose between patient care and financial survival. Sarah had watched good nurses leave for better-paying positions at private hospitals, leaving behind those who either couldn't afford to quit or refused to abandon the community that depended on them. Sarah's own financial situation fell squarely into the first category. The nursing school loans that had seemed manageable during her optimistic student days now felt like concrete blocks chained to her ankles. Every month brought the same careful calculation: rent, loan payments, groceries, and bus fare, with little left over for anything resembling a normal life for someone approaching 30. She'd taken the double shifts, not out of ambition, but out of necessity, watching her bank account hover dangerously close to empty while she poured her energy into caring for others. The emergency room began its familiar morning crescendo as Sarah settled into her routine. Patients arrived in waves, each bringing their own crisis, their own story of pain or fear or desperation. Sarah moved between rooms with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, administering medications, and offering the kind of calm reassurance that had become her trademark. She discovered early in her career that patients responded to genuine warmth, that a gentle touch or a moment of real attention could be as healing as any prescription. As the morning wore on, Sarah noticed a figure that didn't quite fit the usual emergency room pattern. A man in an expensive-looking coat sat in the corner of the waiting room, his posture too straight, his clothes too clean for someone seeking emergency medical care. He claimed to be waiting for treatment of a minor wrist injury, but Sarah observed that he spent more time watching the staff than examining his supposedly injured hand. Something about his presence felt deliberate, purposeful, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what bothered her about him. Dr. James Mitchell had arrived at St. Mary's before dawn, armed with a fabricated story about a tennis injury and a carefully constructed false identity. As the president's senior medical advisor, he'd spent years in sterile Washington offices, crafting policy from behind mahogany desks and theoretical frameworks. The president had tasked him with conducting a secret assessment of public hospital conditions before announcing a major healthcare initiative. But Mitchell had never expected to find himself in the gritty reality of an understaffed emergency room in downtown Phoenix. From his corner seat, Mitchell watched the controlled chaos unfold. He observed nurses working 12-hour shifts without adequate breaks, doctors making impossible decisions about which patients to prioritize, and a system stretched so thin that genuine care seemed to happen only through the superhuman efforts of individual staff members. Sarah Chen had caught his attention within the first hour, not because of any single dramatic gesture, but because of her consistent kindness toward every patient who crossed her path. The afternoon brought a steady stream of cases that tested everyone's patience and stamina. Sarah found herself running between rooms, checking on a diabetic patient whose insulin levels had destabilized, comforting a child with a broken arm, and trying to locate a translator for an elderly man who spoke only Spanish. The constant motion helped her forget about her empty stomach and the fact that she'd been on her feet for nearly 8 hours straight. This was the part of nursing that nursing school had never adequately prepared her for. The physical and emotional endurance required to care for an endless parade of human suffering while maintaining professional composure. As evening approached, the emergency room's fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the waiting room more crowded, and the staff more frayed. Sarah was updating patient charts when Tom Davis, the evening security guard, approached her station with a concerned expression. Tom had worked at St. Mary's for over a decade, and his weathered face had seen every variety of human drama the city could produce. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. His calm demeanor made his current agitation all the more noticeable. "Sarah, we've got a situation in the parking garage," Tom said, keeping his voice low to avoid attracting attention from nearby patients. "There's a guy been sleeping down there for the past week. Looks like he's in rough shape, but he won't come up for help. Security protocol says I should call it in, but I thought maybe you'd want to take a look first." Sarah glanced toward Director Linda Thompson's office, where the administrative lights still burned bright despite the late hour. Hospital policy was clear about unauthorized individuals on the premises, and the administration had been increasingly strict about enforcing rules that might affect their liability insurance. But Tom's description suggested someone who needed medical attention, and Sarah's training made it impossible for her to ignore that possibility. "Show me," she said simply, grabbing a basic medical kit from the supply cabinet. The parking garage. Beneath St. Mary's was a concrete cavern that smelled of motor oil and exhaust fumes. Flickering fluorescent strips cast uneven shadows between the rows of cars belonging to hospital staff working late shifts. Tom led Sarah to the far corner, where the lighting was poorest and the security cameras had blind spots. There, tucked between a concrete pillar and an abandoned shopping cart, was a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard and old blankets. Marcus Rodriguez looked up as they approached, his eyes reflecting the wariness of someone who'd learned to expect trouble from uniformed officials. At 45, Mac carried the physical markers of hard living, clothes that had seen too many nights outdoors, hands scarred from manual labor, and the hollow-eyed exhaustion of chronic homelessness. But Sarah also noticed details that spoke to his efforts to maintain dignity. His beard was neatly trimmed, his clothes were clean despite their worn condition, and his small camp was organized with military precision. "I'm not causing trouble," Mac said immediately, his voice hoarse but firm. "I clean up after myself, don't bother nobody. Just need a dry place to sleep." Sarah knelt down slowly, maintaining eye contact to show she wasn't a threat. "I'm Sarah. I'm a nurse upstairs. Tom here was worried about you. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? Mac's initial defensive posture softened slightly at Sarah's tone. He'd grown accustomed to being moved along, questioned, or ignored entirely. Genuine concern from a medical professional was unexpected enough to catch him off guard. Got some chest pain, he admitted reluctantly. Probably nothing serious. Don't have insurance anyway. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. Chest pain in a middle-aged man with obvious stress factors was never something to dismiss lightly. She could see the signs of someone who'd been avoiding medical care out of financial necessity, letting potentially serious symptoms worsen rather than seek help he couldn't afford. This was exactly the kind of situation that kept her up at night, knowing that people suffered needlessly because healthcare had become a luxury rather than a right. Mac, chest pain isn't something to ignore, Sarah said gently. Let me at least check your vital signs. No insurance required for that. Dr. Mitchell had followed at a discreet distance, curious about where the nurse was heading with a medical kit after hours. From the garage entrance, he could observe the interaction without interfering. What he witnessed challenged every assumption he'd made about public hospital efficiency and protocol. Here was a nurse, clearly exhausted from a long shift, voluntarily, extending care to someone who couldn't pay, in a location that was technically outside her job responsibilities. Mac's reluctance to accept help spoke to a story Sarah had heard countless times. He'd served 2 tours in Iraq as an army medic, returning home with invisible wounds that the Veterans Affairs system seemed designed to ignore rather than treat. PTSD, chronic pain, and a system that made accessing benefits an exercise in bureaucratic endurance had gradually eroded his ability to maintain employment and housing. The chest pain he'd been experiencing for weeks was probably stress-related, but without insurance or a permanent address, seeking treatment seemed impossible. Sarah's examination revealed elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and signs of chronic stress that definitely warranted professional medical attention. Mac's military background became apparent as she worked. His automatic responses to medical procedures and his knowledge of basic medical terminology indicating someone who'd once been responsible for keeping others alive under extreme conditions. Mac, you need proper tests, Sarah said after completing her assessment. An EKG, maybe some blood work. This could be serious. Mac shook his head firmly. Can't afford it. Emergency room visit would cost me months of what little money I get. I'll be fine. Sarah found herself facing the same impossible choice that confronted healthcare workers across the country every day. Professional ethics demanded that she ensure Mac received proper medical care, but the reality of hospital policies and insurance requirements created barriers that seemed designed to prevent people like him from accessing treatment. She could walk away, report his presence to security, and let the system handle him according to protocol. Or she could find a way to help that would inevitably put her own job at risk. The decision wasn't really a decision at all. Sarah's fundamental nature made it impossible for her to walk away from someone in medical need, regardless of the potential consequences for her own employment. She'd become a nurse to help people, and Mac needed help in a way that the system was clearly failing to provide. Tom, can you give us a few more minutes? Sarah asked. Tom nodded and retreated to the garage entrance, understanding that some situations required flexibility rather than strict adherence to protocol. Sarah helped Mac gather his belongings and convinced him to come upstairs for proper testing. She knew exactly how to navigate the emergency room's computer system to admit him as a patient without immediately triggering insurance verification procedures. It was a temporary solution that would buy time for proper diagnosis and treatment, though she understood that Director Thompson would eventually discover the unauthorized admission and demand explanations Sarah couldn't provide without admitting to policy violations. Dr. Mitchell watched from the waiting room as Sarah brought Mac through the emergency room entrance. The care she took to help him maintain dignity, her gentle guidance through the admission process, and her obvious concern for his welfare demonstrated a level of compassion that policy manuals couldn't teach and bureaucratic systems actively discouraged. Mitchell found himself witnessing healthcare as it should be: immediate, compassionate, and focused entirely on patient welfare rather than financial considerations. Over the next several hours, Sarah ensured that Mac received comprehensive testing and evaluation. The EKG revealed minor irregularities that required monitoring but weren't immediately life-threatening. Blood work showed vitamin deficiencies and markers of chronic stress consistent with his living situation. Most importantly, the examination provided Mac with professional medical documentation that could help him navigate the Veterans Affairs system more effectively. Sarah spent her break time helping Mac complete paperwork for VA benefits and connecting him with social services that might provide housing assistance. She used her personal phone to call contact numbers for veteran support organizations, leveraging relationships she'd built with social workers over her years at St. Mary's. Her investment in Mac's welfare went far beyond the medical treatment that had brought him to the emergency room. Dr. Mitchell observed these interactions with growing amazement. Sarah was essentially functioning as a social worker, benefits counselor, and patient advocate in addition to providing medical care. She was doing the job that a properly funded healthcare system should have multiple people handling, and she was doing it with a grace and competence that suggested this level of comprehensive care was normal for her rather than exceptional. As dawn approached, Director Thompson arrived for her morning rounds to discover Mac's admission in the system. Sarah was completing her second consecutive shift when Thompson summoned her to the office, her expression indicating that explanations would be required and consequences would follow. The conversation that ensued was brief and decisive. Unauthorized patient admissions violated hospital policy, created liability issues, and threatened the institution's already precarious financial situation. Sarah's employment was terminated immediately. Mac was discharged with instructions for follow-up care he couldn't afford and referrals to services that had months-long waiting lists. Sarah cleaned out her locker in silence, her nursing school loans suddenly seeming even more overwhelming without the income to service them. Tom helped her carry her belongings to the bus stop, both of them understanding that St. Mary's had lost one of its most dedicated nurses to a system that prioritized protocol over patient care. Dr. Mitchell had witnessed the entire sequence of events, from Sarah's initial decision to help Mac through her termination the following morning. As he prepared to leave St. Mary's and return to Washington, he carried with him a clear understanding of how healthcare policy affected real people in real situations. Sarah's story embodied everything wrong with American healthcare. Dedicated, professionals forced to choose between their ethics and their employment, patients denied care based on financial status, and systems that punished compassion while rewarding compliance. The report Mitchell would write for the president would be far different from the abstract policy analysis originally intended. Instead, it would focus on specific individuals whose stories illustrated the human cost of healthcare inequity. Sarah. Chen's name would appear prominently in recommendations for systemic reform, though she would remain unaware of the impact her actions had made on someone positioned to influence national policy. As Sarah rode the bus home to her small apartment, she felt the weight of unemployment settling over her like a familiar burden. The nursing shortage meant she would eventually find another position, but the immediate financial crisis threatened everything she'd worked to build. Her decision to help Mac had been instinctive and inevitable, but the consequences were entirely hers to bear. She had no way of knowing that her act of professional courage had been witnessed by someone with the power to transform her personal crisis into a catalyst for national change. Dr. James Mitchell's flight back to Washington carried more weight than the briefcase of policy documents beside him. The image of Sarah Chen's termination replayed in his mind as the aircraft climbed above the Phoenix skyline, each detail etched with the clarity that comes from witnessing genuine injustice. The sterile comfort of first class felt obscene after 24 hours in St. Mary's emergency room, where he'd seen healthcare stripped down to its most essential elements. Human beings caring for other human beings despite institutional barriers, designed to prevent exactly that kind of compassion. Mitchell's position as presidential medical advisor had insulated him from the ground-level realities he'd just experienced. Policy briefings and statistical analyses had painted healthcare challenges in abstract terms, problems to be solved through legislative frameworks and budgetary allocations. But Sarah's story transformed those abstractions into something visceral and immediate. She'd lost her livelihood for doing precisely what medical ethics demanded, while a system that claimed to prioritize patient welfare had actively punished her for providing care to someone who needed it. The Gulfstream's cabin phone rang as they reached cruising altitude. Mitchell's assistant informed him that the president wanted a preliminary briefing within hours of his return, eager to hear first-hand observations that would inform the upcoming healthcare initiative announcement. Mitchell found himself drafting mental notes that bore no resemblance to the sanitized policy recommendations he'd originally planned to deliver. Instead, his report would center on specific individuals whose experiences illustrated everything wrong with American healthcare delivery. Meanwhile, in Phoenix, Sarah Chen sat in her apartment's tiny kitchen, surrounded by financial documents that painted an increasingly desperate picture. Her termination from St. Mary's had triggered a cascade of immediate concerns: health insurance that would expire within days, student loan payments that consumed most of her savings, and rent obligations that couldn't be postponed. The classified ads for nursing positions offered hope, but the hiring process at other hospitals would take weeks, and her abrupt termination would require explanations that might complicate her prospects. The apartment felt smaller than usual, its limitations more pronounced now that unemployment had made every dollar precious. Sarah had chosen the modest one-bedroom space in Mesa specifically because the rent left enough income to service her educational debt, but that careful financial balance now seemed impossibly fragile. The furniture she'd accumulated over 2 years of working at St. Mary's represented the slow accumulation of stability that was now threatened by her decision to treat Mac Rodriguez. She didn't regret helping Mac, even as the consequences crystallized around her. Nursing school had taught her that patient advocacy was a fundamental professional responsibility, but the reality of practicing medicine in an underfunded public hospital had revealed how frequently that responsibility conflicted with institutional priorities. Sarah had watched colleagues make similar choices, balancing their ethical obligations against employment security, and she'd seen good nurses leave the profession entirely rather than compromise their values. Mac Rodriguez had spent the morning navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of Veterans Affairs, armed with the medical documentation Sarah had helped him obtain. The clean bill of health and professional referrals she'd provided gave him credibility with VA counselors who were accustomed to processing claims without adequate medical backing. For the first time in months, Mac felt like he was making progress toward accessing the benefits he'd earned through his military service. The irony wasn't lost on him that the nurse who'd provided the medical care enabling his progress had lost her job in the process. Mac had learned about Sarah's termination through Tom Davis, who'd kept in touch to check on his welfare. The security guard's network of contacts throughout Phoenix's homeless community had made him an unofficial liaison between St. Mary's staff and the people they served off the books. Mac's experience with military medicine had taught him to recognize exceptional medical professionals, and Sarah's combination of clinical competence and personal compassion reminded him of the best field medics he'd worked with in Iraq. Those medics had saved lives under impossible conditions, often improvising solutions that violated standard protocols but achieved results that textbook medicine couldn't match. Sarah's willingness to bend hospital rules to ensure he received proper care demonstrated the same kind of battlefield pragmatism. Dr. Mitchell's preliminary briefing with the President took place in the Oval Office, where the weight of executive authority made every word seem consequential. The President listened intently as Mitchell described his observations at St. Mary's, particularly the conflict between institutional policies and patient care that Sarah's story illustrated. The upcoming healthcare initiative was designed to address exactly these kinds of systemic failures, but hearing specific examples of how those failures affected real people gave the policy agenda emotional urgency it had previously lacked. The President's questions focused on scalability and implementation. If Sarah Chen's experience was representative of dedicated healthcare workers nationwide, then the proposed reforms needed to address not just funding mechanisms, but the regulatory frameworks that forced professionals to choose between their ethics and their employment. Mitchell's recommendation to include specific protections for healthcare workers who prioritized patient welfare over institutional protocols was noted for inclusion in the legislative package. As their conversation concluded, the President made a decision that would remain classified until implementation was complete. The healthcare initiative would need a human face, a story that illustrated both the problems and the solutions the administration hoped to achieve. Sarah Chen's experience provided exactly the kind of narrative that could transform abstract policy discussions into compelling arguments for reform. Back in Phoenix, Sarah's job search had produced several promising leads, though none offered the immediate employment she desperately needed. Hospital hiring processes were notoriously slow, involving background checks, credentialing verification, and committee approvals that could stretch for weeks. Private clinics moved faster, but typically offered lower wages and fewer benefits than the public hospital positions she preferred. Her conversation with the nurse recruiter at Phoenix Children's Hospital had gone particularly well, with the interviewer expressing admiration for her willingness to advocate for patients even at personal cost. The pediatric unit was chronically understaffed, and Sarah's experience with diverse patient populations made her an attractive candidate. However, the position wouldn't begin for another month, leaving her with immediate financial pressures that threatened to overwhelm her careful budgeting. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's apartment complex. Mac Rodriguez stood at her door, holding a small potted plant and wearing clothes that were clean but obviously borrowed from a larger man. His appearance had improved dramatically since their encounter in the hospital parking garage, though the stress lines around his eyes suggested that his housing situation remained precarious. "I wanted to thank you properly," Mac said when Sarah opened the door, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that military training had ingrained. "And to apologize for getting you in trouble. Tom told me what happened." Sarah invited him in, noting how his military bearing made her small apartment seem even more cramped. Mac's discomfort with indoor spaces was apparent in the way he positioned himself near the door, maintaining clear sight lines and escape routes that spoke to hypervigilance developed in combat zones. She'd learned enough about PTSD during her nursing training to recognize the behavioral patterns, though Mac's symptoms seemed well managed compared to some veterans she'd encountered. Their conversation revealed details about Mac's background that hospital protocols hadn't allowed time to explore. He'd served as a field medic with the 82nd Airborne, completing 2 deployments to Iraq before returning to a civilian healthcare system that seemed designed to frustrate rather than assist veterans seeking treatment. The transition from military structure to civilian chaos had been particularly difficult for someone whose identity was built around helping others in medical crises. Mac's homelessness had resulted from a perfect storm of circumstances: PTSD symptoms that made steady employment difficult, medical bills from civilian treatment that VA benefits didn't cover, and a housing market that priced working-class veterans out of stable accommodations. His military pension provided barely enough income to cover basic necessities, and the bureaucratic requirements for accessing additional VA services created barriers that seemed almost deliberately obstructive. Sarah found herself comparing Mac's situation to her own financial pressures, recognizing that both of them had dedicated their careers to helping others, only to discover that society provided little safety net for the helpers themselves. The difference was that Mac's service-connected injuries entitled him to benefits that were theoretically available, while her student debt represented an individual burden that no government program was designed to address. Their conversation was interrupted by a phone call that would begin to change everything, though neither of them could have anticipated its significance. The caller identified himself as Robert Chen, claiming to be a distant relative of Sarah's who'd heard about her recent employment difficulties through family networks. His offer to meet for coffee seemed innocuous enough, though Sarah couldn't recall any relatives named Robert, and found his knowledge of her termination from St. Mary's somewhat puzzling. Dr. Mitchell had returned to Washington with a clear mission that extended beyond his original assessment mandate. The president's interest in Sarah's story had prompted a broader investigation into healthcare workers who'd been penalized for prioritizing patient welfare over institutional policies. The preliminary research had revealed hundreds of similar cases nationwide, suggesting that Sarah's experience represented a systemic problem rather than an isolated incident. The White House Domestic Policy Council had assembled a task force to develop implementation strategies for the healthcare initiative, with Mitchell serving as medical liaison. The group's recommendations would inform both the legislative package and the executive actions needed to support healthcare workers who found themselves in Sarah's situation. However, the timeline for political action moved slowly compared to the immediate financial pressures facing individuals who'd lost their livelihoods for doing what their professional training demanded. Mitchell's recommendation for a pilot program to provide immediate financial support for healthcare workers facing employment retaliation had gained traction within the administration. The program would need to operate outside normal bureaucratic channels to provide timely assistance. But the president's personal interest in Sarah's case had given the initiative unusual priority within White House policy development processes. Sarah's meeting with the mysterious relative took place at a coffee shop near Arizona State University, where the afternoon crowd of students and faculty provided comfortable anonymity. Robert Chen appeared to be in his 40s, professionally, dressed but approachable, with a demeanor that suggested government service rather than private sector employment. His knowledge of Sarah's family background was detailed enough to establish credibility, though his interest in her recent employment situation seemed disproportionate to their supposed relationship. The conversation that followed would later seem surreal in its implications, though at the time it felt like an ordinary discussion between family members catching up on recent developments. Robert's questions about her termination from St. Mary's were sympathetic but probing, seeking details about hospital policies and her interactions with administrators that went beyond casual curiosity. When Robert mentioned that he worked for a federal agency involved in healthcare policy development, Sarah began to understand that their meeting might have purposes beyond family solidarity. His offer to connect her with resources for healthcare workers facing employment difficulties seemed suspiciously well-timed, though his explanations for how he'd learned about her situation remained vague. Mac Rodriguez had used his afternoon productively, following up on the VA counselor's referrals and beginning the paperwork process for housing assistance. The documentation Sarah had provided gave his applications credibility they'd previously lacked, and for the first time in months, he felt optimistic about his prospects for stable accommodation. The irony that his progress had cost someone else. Their employment continued to weigh on him, creating a sense of obligation that went beyond simple gratitude. His military training had taught him the importance of taking care of fellow service members, and Mac had begun to think of Sarah as belonging to that category despite her civilian status. Her willingness to sacrifice her own security for his welfare demonstrated the kind of battlefield loyalty that created bonds transcending formal military relationships. The debt he owed her couldn't be repaid with simple thanks or borrowed plants. The evening brought developments that would accelerate the timeline for everything that followed, though none of the participants could have predicted how quickly their individual situations would converge into something much larger. Dr. Mitchell's briefing materials were being reviewed by presidential staff who specialized in transforming policy proposals into public events that could capture national attention. Sarah's financial calculations had reached a critical point where immediate action would be necessary to avoid defaulting on her obligations. The job interviews had gone well, but even the most optimistic timeline would leave her without income for several more weeks. The conversation with Robert Chen had provided some hope for federal assistance programs, though the details remained frustratingly vague. Mac's progress with Veterans Affairs had accelerated beyond his expectations, with housing vouchers and medical benefits being processed with unusual efficiency. The VA counselor had mentioned that his case had been flagged for expedited review. Though the reasons for this special attention weren't entirely clear, the convergence of these seemingly separate developments was being orchestrated by forces none of them fully understood, as Dr. Mitchell's recommendations began to translate into executive action that would soon affect their lives in ways that defied all reasonable expectations. The morning of January 15th dawned crisp and clear across the Phoenix metropolitan area, with temperatures that made winter feel almost pleasant in the desert southwest. Sarah Chen had spent the previous evening updating her resume and preparing for another round of job interviews. Her small apartment's kitchen table transformed into a makeshift office covered with hospital applications and financial documents. The stress of unemployment had begun affecting her sleep, leaving her tired despite the luxury of sleeping past dawn for the first time in months. Her coffee was still brewing when the first unusual sound reached her from outside. The steady thrum of helicopter rotors was common enough near the airport, but this sound seemed closer, more immediate, and strangely persistent. Sarah glanced toward her window, noting that the sound wasn't fading as aircraft typically did when passing overhead. Instead, the mechanical rhythm seemed to be intensifying, as if the helicopter was circling or perhaps looking for a place to land. Mac Rodriguez had risen before sunrise, a habit ingrained by decades of military routine that civilian life hadn't managed to break. His temporary accommodation at the transitional housing facility near downtown Phoenix provided basic amenities and safety, but the shared quarters and institutional atmosphere made peaceful sleep elusive. The progress he'd made with Veterans Affairs had accelerated dramatically over the past week, with benefits approvals and housing assistance being processed with efficiency that defied his previous experiences with government bureaucracy. The Facility's common room buzzed with morning news programs and the quiet conversations of men trying to rebuild their lives after various combinations of service injuries, economic hardship, and bureaucratic frustration. Mac had become something of an unofficial counselor to newer residents, sharing hard-won knowledge about navigating VA systems and connecting with local resources. His own recent success had given hope to others who'd grown cynical about the possibility of accessing the help they'd earned through military service. Tom Davis was beginning his morning shift at St. Mary's when reports started coming through emergency services channels about unusual aircraft activity in the Phoenix area. Air traffic control had logged several military helicopters operating outside normal flight patterns, with at least one requesting permission for an emergency landing in a residential area. The communications suggested federal law enforcement or national security operations, though no specific details were being shared with local authorities. The hospital's emergency preparedness protocols included procedures for responding to various crisis scenarios, from natural disasters to terrorist attacks. But the morning's activities didn't match any standard threat assessment. Tom's security experience had taught him to pay attention to patterns that seemed ordinary on the surface, but suggested coordinated activity underneath. The morning's helicopter traffic felt deliberately orchestrated rather than coincidentally clustered. Dr. Mitchell's return to Washington had initiated a series of meetings and policy discussions that moved with unusual speed through normally glacial government processes. The president's personal interest in Sarah Chen's story had elevated her case from a single data point in a policy briefing to a central element in a major healthcare initiative that would be announced within days. The White House communications team had been developing messaging strategies that would use real stories to illustrate abstract policy proposals. The decision to make Sarah's situation a centerpiece of the healthcare announcement had required careful coordination between multiple federal agencies. The Department of Health and Human Services would handle policy implementation, while Veterans Affairs would address the broader issues Mac's case illustrated about healthcare access for former military personnel. The timing of the announcement had been moved up to capitalize on current political momentum around healthcare reform. Mitchell had spent the previous evening reviewing final preparations for what would become the most unconventional policy rollout of his career. Traditional government announcements took place in sterile Washington conference rooms, with carefully scripted presentations designed to minimize political risk. The president's directive to take the announcement directly to the people whose stories had inspired the initiative represented a dramatic departure from standard practice. Sarah was checking her email for responses to job applications when her phone rang with a call from Robert Chen, the mysterious relative who'd appeared so unexpectedly in her life. His voice carried an urgency that hadn't been present during their coffee shop conversation, and his request to meet immediately seemed oddly insistent for someone claiming to be a distant family member interested in her welfare. "Sarah, I need you to be at your apartment complex's parking lot in 30 minutes, Robert said, his tone shifting from family familiarity to something approaching official authority. "There's something important happening that you need to be a part of. I know this sounds strange, but please trust me on this." The cryptic nature of Robert's request triggered warning bells in Sarah's mind, though she couldn't identify any specific threat in his words. Her nursing training had developed strong instincts about potentially dangerous situations, but Robert's urgency seemed more excited than threatening. Still, the request to meet in a parking lot with minimal explanation violated every personal safety protocol she'd learned. Mac received a similar phone call from his VA counselor, who requested his immediate presence at the transitional housing facility for what was described as an important announcement regarding his benefit status. The counselor's tone suggested Positive developments rather than bureaucratic complications, though the timing and urgency seemed inconsistent with normal government operations. Mac's military experience had taught him to follow orders first and ask questions later, but civilian agencies typically moved at deliberate speeds that made emergency meetings highly unusual. The transitional housing facility's staff seemed unusually energetic as residents gathered in the common room for the announced meeting. Several men Mac didn't recognize had arrived early, wearing suits that suggested federal employment and carrying themselves with the bearing of people accustomed to authority. Their presence transformed the normally casual atmosphere into something approaching a formal briefing. Sarah's decision to meet Robert in the parking lot was influenced partly by curiosity and partly by the realization that her current circumstances left her with few options to lose. Unemployment had created a sense of limbo where unexpected opportunities seemed worth investigating, even when their legitimacy remained questionable. She dressed professionally, as if the mysterious meeting might somehow relate to employment prospects, and brought her nursing credentials in case identification became necessary. The apartment complex's parking lot was nearly empty in the mid-morning hours, with most residents away at work or school. Sarah arrived early and positioned herself near her own vehicle, maintaining options for quick departure if the situation developed in concerning directions. The desert morning was warming quickly, promising another day of the mild temperatures that made Phoenix winters almost pleasant for people accustomed to harsher climates. The sound of approaching helicopters had grown steadily louder over the past hour, and Sarah could now see aircraft circling in the distance. The mechanical rhythm was hypnotic and somehow ominous, though she couldn't identify any logical reason to feel threatened by helicopter activity near a major metropolitan area. Still, the persistence of the sound and its apparent concentration in her general vicinity seemed too coincidental to ignore. Robert Chen appeared precisely on schedule, though his demeanor had transformed completely from their previous meeting. The casual friendliness had been replaced by professional efficiency, and his clothing had shifted from business casual to something approaching formal government attire. The transformation was so complete that Sarah briefly wondered if this was the same person she'd met for coffee. "Sarah, thank you for trusting me," Robert said as he approached her position near the cars. "I owe you some explanations, starting with the fact that Robert Chen isn't my real name, and I'm not actually your relative. I work for the federal government, and your situation has come to the attention of some very important people." The revelation that Robert had misrepresented his identity should have been alarming, but his calm delivery and professional demeanor made the confession seem more like a necessary clarification than a threatening admission. Sarah's nursing experience had taught her to read people quickly, and Robert projected competence and authority rather than danger. Still, the implications of federal government interest in her employment termination seemed disproportionate to the actual significance of her case. Mac's meeting at the transitional housing facility had taken an equally unexpected turn when the VA counselor introduced him to several federal officials whose credentials suggested involvement in national, rather than local Veterans Affairs. Their questions focused on his experience with VA healthcare systems and his recent interactions with civilian medical providers, particularly his treatment at St. Mary's General Hospital. The official's interest in Sarah Chen seemed surprisingly detailed, suggesting that her involvement in Mac's case had been thoroughly investigated. Their questions about her professional competence and personal character felt more like a job interview than a bureaucratic inquiry. Though Mac couldn't imagine what federal position might require such specific knowledge about a nurse he'd met only briefly. The realization that Sarah's termination from St. Mary's was being discussed in federal policy contexts filled Mac with a complex mixture of pride and guilt. pride that someone who'd helped him was receiving recognition for her professional dedication, but guilt that his need for medical care had created the circumstances leading to her unemployment. The military had taught him that good people sometimes suffered consequences for doing the right thing, but civilian life was supposed to offer more protection for ethical behavior. Sarah's conversation with the federal agent continued to reveal layers of complexity she hadn't anticipated. Her case had apparently become part of a broader investigation into healthcare worker retaliation, with her termination serving as a representative example of systemic problems affecting medical professionals nationwide. The agent's explanation of how her story had reached federal attention involved a chain of reporting that traced back to an unidentified observer at St. Mary's during her interaction with Mac. The mention of an observer triggered memories of the well-dressed man who'd sat in the emergency room during Mac's treatment, seemingly waiting for medical attention that never materialized. Sarah had noticed him peripherally during her shift, noting his apparent lack of urgent medical needs and his unusual attention to staff activities. The possibility that this mysterious patient had been documenting her actions for federal review seemed simultaneously flattering and invasive. The sound of helicopter rotors had continued to intensify throughout their conversation, and now Sarah could see multiple aircraft circling at low altitude. The sight was impressive and slightly unnerving, suggesting coordinated activity that went far beyond routine aviation operations. The federal agent's presence was beginning to make more sense as part of whatever larger event was unfolding around them. Sarah, in about 10 minutes, you're going to witness something that's never happened before in American healthcare policy, the agent said, his tone shifting to something approaching ceremonial formality. The President of the United States is coming here to personally thank you for your service to Mac Rodriguez and to announce a new national healthcare initiative that's partly inspired by your actions. The statement was so unexpected that Sarah's mind initially rejected it as impossible. Presidents didn't visit apartment complexes in Mesa, Arizona, to thank unemployed nurses for policy violations that had cost them their jobs. The scale of what the agent was describing seemed completely disproportionate to her actual actions, which had been motivated by basic professional ethics rather than any intention to influence national policy. Mac was receiving similar information at the transitional housing facility, where federal officials were explaining that his case had become part of a presidential healthcare initiative. The president would be visiting Phoenix to announce new programs supporting both healthcare workers and veterans, with Mac and Sarah serving as examples of the problems the initiative was designed to address. The surreal nature of the announcement left Mac struggling to process the implications. The first presidential helicopter appeared over the apartment complex exactly as the federal agent had predicted, its distinctive markings clearly visible. As it circled the area in a display of controlled precision, the sight was simultaneously thrilling and overwhelming, representing a level of federal attention that seemed impossible to connect with Sarah's simple decision to provide medical care to someone who needed it. Additional helicopters followed, creating an aerial convoy that attracted attention from throughout the neighborhood. Residents emerged from apartments and houses to witness the unprecedented display, many filming with their phones as the aircraft established a perimeter around the landing zone. The professional coordination of the operation suggested extensive advanced planning, though Sarah couldn't imagine how federal officials had anticipated her presence with such precision. The lead helicopter descended toward the apartment complex's central courtyard, a space barely large enough to accommodate the aircraft safely. The rotor wash sent debris swirling through the parking lot and forced spectators to retreat to safer distances, but the pilot's skill in managing the landing was evident in the smooth touchdown that minimized disruption to the surrounding area. Sarah watched in amazement as the helicopter's engines spooled down, and the side door opened to reveal Secret Service agents who immediately began establishing security protocols around the landing zone. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, their presence transforming the modest apartment complex into something approaching a military installation. The reality of presidential involvement was becoming undeniably apparent. Mac arrived at the apartment complex in a government vehicle accompanied by the federal officials from his meeting, his expression reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and excitement that Sarah was experiencing. The reunion between them took place under circumstances neither could have imagined when he'd visited her apartment to express gratitude for her help. The simple act of kindness that had connected them was apparently resonating at levels of government they'd never considered. The moment when the President of the United States stepped out of the helicopter would remain etched in Sarah's memory with perfect clarity. The leader of the free world walked across the parking lot of her modest apartment complex, surrounded by security agents, but moving with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to making history wherever he went. The surreal nature of the scene made it feel like an elaborate dream, though the crowds of neighbors and media crews confirmed its reality. President's approach to Sarah and Mac was direct and personal, his demeanor suggesting genuine interest in their stories rather than political theater. His first words acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting while expressing authentic appreciation for the actions that had brought them to federal attention. Sarah and Mac, thank you both for reminding us what American healthcare should look like, the president said, his voice carrying easily over the residual noise from the helicopters. Your story proves that the best medical care happens when dedicated. Professionals put patients first, regardless of institutional barriers or personal cost. The president's words carried across the apartment complex courtyard with the authority that only comes from the highest office in the land. But his tone was warm and personal rather than ceremonial. Standing between Sarah and Mac with the presidential helicopter as a backdrop and Secret Service agents maintaining a respectful perimeter, he seemed less like a political figure and more like someone genuinely moved by their story. The media crews that had materialized from nowhere captured every word, but the president's attention remained focused entirely on the two people whose actions had prompted this unprecedented visit. What you both represent, the president continued, addressing not just Sarah and Mac, but the growing crowd of residents and onlookers, is the best of American healthcare and American service. Sarah, your willingness to put patient care above institutional policy shows us what medical ethics really means. Mac, your service to our country and your dignity in the face of homelessness reminds us of our obligations to those who've sacrificed for our freedom. Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her, phone cameras recording her every reaction, and the surreal pressure of representing something much larger than her individual story. The unemployed nurse, who'd been struggling to pay her bills just hours earlier, was now standing beside the President of the United States, being praised for actions that had seemed like simple professional duty when she'd performed them. The disconnect between her personal reality and this national moment was almost impossible to process. Mac's military bearing served him well in the overwhelming circumstances, his posture straight and his expression composed despite the emotional turbulence of having his homelessness and struggles discussed on what was clearly becoming a national stage. The transformation from sleeping in a hospital parking garage to standing beside the president felt like the kind of dramatic reversal that happened in movies rather than real life. Yet the desert sun on his face and the helicopter rotors cooling in the background confirmed the impossible reality. Dr. Mitchell appeared at the president's side, his familiar face providing Sarah with the first piece of the puzzle that explained how her story had reached such heights. The well-dressed observer from St. Mary's emergency room was clearly much more than a patient with a minor injury, and his presence beside the president suggested connections between her termination and federal policy that she was only beginning to understand. The realization that she'd been watched and evaluated without her knowledge felt invasive, but the positive outcomes emerging from that surveillance made it difficult to feel violated. Dr. Mitchell has been telling me about the remarkable healthcare workers he encountered during his assessment of public hospitals, the president said, gesturing toward his advisor. Your story, Sarah, became the foundation for a new national initiative that we're announcing today. The Chen Healthcare Worker Protection Act will provide federal support for medical professionals who face retaliation for prioritizing patient care over institutional policies. The naming of federal legislation after her and Mac was so unexpected that Sarah felt her knees weaken slightly. The idea that her termination from St. Mary's could inspire national policy changes seemed impossible to reconcile with her current unemployment and financial pressures. Federal legislation moved through congressional processes that took months or years, yet the president was discussing implementation timelines that suggested immediate action. Mac's reaction to having his name attached to federal healthcare legislation was more complicated, colored by years of frustration with government bureaucracy that had made accessing his earned benefits unnecessarily difficult. The military had taught him to be skeptical of grand promises from political leaders, yet the president's presence in his transitional housing facilities neighborhood suggested a level of personal commitment that went beyond typical campaign rhetoric. The crowd of residents, neighbors, and media representatives had grown significantly as word of the presidential visit spread through Phoenix. Local news helicopters circled overhead, maintaining respectful distances from the federal aircraft while capturing aerial footage of the unprecedented scene. Sarah could see familiar faces from her apartment complex, mixed with strangers who'd been drawn by the commotion, all of them witnessing her transformation from unemployed nurse to national symbol. The Healthcare Worker Protection Program will begin immediately, the president announced, his voice projecting clearly across the gathered crowd. Sarah, you'll receive full compensation for your lost wages, immediate health insurance restoration, and a federal position developing implementation guidelines for the new program. Mac, your case will be expedited through every VA system, and you'll receive immediate housing assistance and comprehensive healthcare coverage. The practical implications of the president's announcement began to register as Sarah absorbed the details. Federal employment would solve her immediate financial crisis while providing the kind of job security that hospital positions rarely offered. The opportunity to influence national healthcare policy represented a career advancement she'd never imagined possible, transforming her professional setback into something approaching a calling. Mac's military experience had taught him to listen carefully to official promises, noting specific commitments versus general aspirations. The president's mention of immediate assistance suggested executive actions that could bypass normal bureaucratic delays, though Mac remained cautiously optimistic about whether federal promises would translate into tangible improvements in his daily life. Dr. Mitchell stepped forward to provide additional details about the healthcare initiative, his medical credentials lending authority to the policy explanations. The program would establish federal protections for healthcare workers who faced employment retaliation for patient advocacy, create funding mechanisms for public hospitals serving disadvantaged populations, and streamline veteran healthcare access through civilian medical providers. Sarah's experience at St. Mary's Hospital illustrates a nationwide problem, Dr. Mitchell explained to the assembled media. Dedicated healthcare workers are being forced to choose between their professional ethics and their economic survival. This initiative will ensure that doing the right thing for patients becomes the protected choice rather than the punished one. The policy framework Dr. Mitchell described addressed systemic issues that Sarah had witnessed throughout her nursing career. Understaffed public hospitals operated under financial pressures that often conflicted with optimal patient care, creating ethical dilemmas for medical staff who wanted to serve their communities effectively. Federal support for institutions serving low-income populations could help align institutional incentives with professional values. Sarah's role in developing implementation guidelines would draw on her frontline experience in ways that traditional policy development rarely achieved. Most healthcare regulations were written by administrators who'd never worked direct patient care, resulting in rules that often seemed disconnected from clinical realities. Her input could help ensure that new protections actually supported the healthcare workers. They were designed to help. The announcement's timing coincided with broader national discussions about healthcare access and affordability, issues that had dominated political discourse for years without producing comprehensive solutions. The president's decision to frame the initiative around individual stories rather than abstract policy proposals represented a strategic approach to building public support for healthcare reform. Mac's case would serve as a pilot program for improved coordination between VA and civilian healthcare systems, addressing bureaucratic barriers that prevented veterans from accessing care through the most convenient or appropriate providers. Sarah's treatment of Mac had demonstrated how civilian medical professionals could effectively serve veteran populations when institutional policies supported rather than hindered such care. The media questions that followed the president's announcement focused heavily on the unprecedented nature of using individual stories to drive federal policy development. Sarah found herself fielding inquiries about her background, her motivations for helping Mac, and her expectations for her new federal role. The attention was overwhelming but manageable, partly because the questions focused on subjects she understood deeply. Mac's responses to media questions reflected his military training in dealing with official inquiries, providing clear answers while avoiding speculation about broader policy implications. His focus remained on the practical aspects of his situation and his gratitude for the assistance that had brought him from homelessness to federal recognition within a matter of weeks. The president's departure was as precisely choreographed as his arrival, with Secret Service agents efficiently managing the transition from public event back to secure transportation. Before boarding the helicopter, he took time for personal conversations with Sarah and Mac that weren't captured by media cameras, offering encouragement and expressing genuine appreciation for their willingness to participate in the public announcement. Sarah's transition from unemployed nurse to federal healthcare policy advisor would begin within days, with temporary housing in Washington and immediate enrollment in comprehensive federal benefits programs. The salary offered was significantly higher than her hospital wages had been, reflecting the specialized nature of her new responsibilities and the administration's commitment to attracting experienced healthcare workers into policy development roles. Mac's housing assistance materialized with unprecedented speed as federal agencies coordinated to provide immediate placement in permanent supportive housing designed specifically for veterans transitioning from homelessness. The comprehensive healthcare coverage included both physical and mental health services, addressing the PTSD and chronic pain issues that had complicated his civilian transition. The weeks following the presidential announcement brought national media attention that transformed Sarah and Mac into symbols of healthcare reform efforts. Their story was featured in major newspapers, television news programs, and social media campaigns supporting the Healthcare Worker Protection Initiative. The personal nature of their experience helped make abstract policy discussions more relatable to general audiences. Sarah's work in Washington involved testifying before congressional committees, meeting with healthcare advocacy groups, and collaborating with policy experts to develop implementation frameworks for the new protections. Her frontline experience provided credibility with both healthcare workers and political leaders who were skeptical of bureaucratic solutions to clinical problems. The federal position offered Sarah opportunities to influence healthcare policy at scales she'd never imagined possible during her hospital nursing career. Her recommendations about staffing ratios, patient advocacy protections, and institutional accountability measures were incorporated into regulatory frameworks that would affect healthcare workers nationwide. Mac's role as a veteran advocate grew organically from his participation in the policy announcement as VA administrators and congressional staff sought his input on improving services for homeless veterans. His military background and personal experience with VA bureaucracy provided insights that helped identify practical barriers to accessing benefits and services. The pilot programs developed around Mac's case demonstrated significant improvements in coordination between VA and civilian healthcare systems. Veterans were able to access care through community providers with streamlined billing and authorization processes, reducing delays and improving health outcomes for populations that had previously fallen through systemic cracks. 6 months after, the presidential helicopter landed in her apartment complex parking lot. Sarah found herself leading a team of healthcare policy specialists developing national guidelines for patient advocacy protections. Her small apartment in Mesa had been replaced by a federal housing allowance that provided comfortable accommodations near her Washington office. Though she maintained connections to Phoenix through regular visits and continued involvement with St. Mary's Hospital improvements, the Healthcare Worker Protection Program had processed hundreds of cases similar to Sarah's, providing legal support and financial assistance to medical professionals who faced retaliation for prioritizing patient welfare. The federal backing had emboldened healthcare workers nationwide to advocate more aggressively for their patients, knowing that their professional ethics were legally protected. Mac's transformation from homeless veteran to national advocate had exceeded every reasonable expectation for personal recovery and professional achievement. His permanent housing in Phoenix provided stability he hadn't experienced since his military service, while his healthcare coverage addressed both service-connected disabilities and civilian health needs through coordinated provider networks. The friendship between Sarah and Mac had evolved into a professional collaboration that continued to influence national healthcare policy. Their joint presentations to medical conferences and policy forums provided powerful testimony about the human impact of systemic healthcare problems and the potential for individual compassion to drive institutional change. St. Mary's General Hospital had become a showcase for implementing the new federal healthcare guidelines, receiving additional funding and technical assistance that improved both working conditions for staff and care quality for patients. Director Linda Thompson, who had terminated Sarah for policy violations, now served on implementation committees developing best practices for patient advocacy support. The apartment complex parking lot where the president had landed was commemorated with a small plaque recognizing the site's role in healthcare policy history, though Sarah and Mac both preferred to focus on the ongoing work rather than the symbolic recognition. Their story had become part of American healthcare reform narrative, but their commitment remained centered on practical improvements for healthcare workers and patients. Dr. Mitchell's assessment of public hospitals had expanded into a comprehensive national study that used Sarah and Mac's experience as a template for identifying systemic problems and developing targeted solutions. His recommendations had influenced federal funding formulas, regulatory frameworks, and professional development programs affecting healthcare workers throughout the country. The Chen Rodriguez Healthcare Worker Protection Act had passed through Congress with bipartisan support, demonstrating how individual stories could transcend political divisions when they illustrated shared values about professional ethics and public service. The legislation provided permanent federal protections for healthcare workers, while establishing funding mechanisms for institutions serving vulnerable populations. As Sarah reflected on the year's events from her federal office overlooking the Potomac River, the transformation from unemployed nurse to national policy leader still seemed surreal despite its undeniable reality. Her decision to help Mac in a hospital parking garage had been motivated by basic professional ethics, yet it had catalyzed changes affecting healthcare workers and patients nationwide. Mac's evening routine in his Phoenix apartment included reading updates about healthcare policy developments and Veterans Affairs improvements that trace back to his encounter with Sarah. The dignity and stability he'd achieved through federal assistance enabled him to help other veterans navigate systems that had once seemed impossibly complex and hostile. The ripple effects of their story continued to expand as healthcare workers across the country found courage to advocate for their patients, knowing that federal protections supported their professional judgment over institutional pressures. The individual act of kindness that had connected Sarah and Mac had become a catalyst for systemic change that honored both medical ethics and public service. Their legacy was measured not in the national attention or federal recognition they'd received, but in the improved lives of healthcare workers who could now prioritize patient care without fear of professional retaliation, and veterans who could access comprehensive care through streamlined systems that treated them with the dignity their service had earned. 2 years had passed since the presidential helicopter had transformed Sarah Chen's modest apartment complex into the unlikely birthplace of national healthcare reform, and the changes that had rippled outward from that extraordinary day continued to reshape American medical care in ways that no policy paper could have predicted. Sarah stood at the podium of the American Nurses Association annual conference in Chicago, looking out at an audience of 3,000 healthcare professionals whose lives had been touched by the legislation that bore her name, though she still found it difficult to reconcile her personal story with the sweeping institutional changes it had inspired. The auditorium buzzed with the energy of professionals who had found renewed purpose in their calling, no longer forced to choose between their ethical obligations and their economic survival. Sarah's keynote address would focus on the practical implementation of patient advocacy protections, but her mind wandered to the individual stories that had emerged from the broader policy changes. Nurses in rural hospitals were speaking up about unsafe staffing ratios without fear of termination. Emergency room physicians were advocating for uninsured patients without worrying about administrative retaliation. The culture of healthcare had shifted in subtle but profound ways that statistics couldn't fully capture. Mac Rodriguez watched the conference livestream from his office at the Phoenix Veterans Affairs Medical Center, where his title of Special Advisor for Veteran Civilian Healthcare Integration reflected a role that had evolved far beyond anything either he or Sarah could have imagined during their first encounter in a hospital parking garage. The irony that a homeless veteran had become instrumental in designing systems to help other homeless veterans wasn't lost on him, though his focus remained on practical results rather than personal recognition. The office walls displayed photographs from medical facilities across the Southwest, showcasing pilot programs that had grown from Mac's individual case into comprehensive models for veteran healthcare delivery. The integration protocols he'd helped develop were being implemented nationwide, reducing bureaucratic barriers that had prevented thousands of veterans from accessing timely medical care. Each success story represented a life improved, a family stabilized, a service member honored through effective rather than ceremonial support. Dr. Mitchell had transitioned from presidential advisor to director of the newly established Institute for Healthcare Worker Advocacy, a federal agency created specifically to monitor and enforce the protections that Sarah and Mac's story had inspired. His Washington office had become a destination for healthcare workers facing retaliation, policy researchers studying medical ethics enforcement, and international delegations seeking to understand how individual stories could drive systemic reform. The Institute's quarterly reports documented measurable improvements in healthcare worker job satisfaction, patient advocacy rates, and institutional compliance with ethical guidelines. More importantly, the cultural shift towards supporting rather than punishing ethical behavior had attracted talented professionals back to careers they'd abandoned due to institutional pressures. Medical schools were reporting increased enrollment, particularly among students motivated by the renewed emphasis on patient advocacy. Sarah's presentation to the nursing conference focused on practical case studies drawn from 2 years of implementing healthcare worker protections. She shared stories of nurses who'd successfully advocated for patient safety improvements without facing professional consequences, emergency departments that had improved care quality by supporting staff concerns about systemic problems, and rural hospitals that had retained experienced nurses by creating cultures that valued ethical decision-making. The audience responded with the kind of engagement that comes from professionals seeing their daily struggles reflected in policy solutions that actually worked. Questions from the floor revealed the depth of transformation that had occurred, with nurses describing workplace environments that prioritized patient welfare over administrative convenience, supervisors who supported rather than discouraged staff advocacy, and institutional policies that aligned with rather than conflicted with professional ethics. One particularly moving question came from a pediatric nurse in Alaska who described how the federal protections had enabled her to report unsafe conditions in her rural hospital's children's unit. The investigation that followed had resulted in facility improvements and staffing increases that potentially saved lives. But more importantly, it had demonstrated that individual nurses could effect institutional change without sacrificing their careers. Mac's work with the Veterans Affairs system had expanded beyond healthcare integration to address the broader challenges of veteran homelessness, employment support, and mental health services. His personal experience with navigating bureaucratic obstacles provided insights that traditional policy development processes rarely captured. The programs he'd helped design were reducing veteran homelessness rates while improving healthcare outcomes for populations that had previously been underserved. The success of veteran civilian healthcare integration had attracted international attention, with delegations from Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia studying the American model for potential adaptation to their own systems. Mac found himself presenting to foreign healthcare officials who were amazed that such comprehensive reforms had emerged from a single encounter between a nurse and a homeless veteran in a hospital parking garage. Sarah's federal role had evolved to include international consulting as countries around the world sought to understand how healthcare worker advocacy could be systematically supported rather than accidentally punished. Her presentations to World Health Organization conferences and international nursing organizations had helped establish global standards for protecting medical professionals who prioritized patient welfare over institutional pressures. The apartment complex where the presidential helicopter had landed had become an unlikely tourist destination, with visitors from around the world coming to see where individual compassion had sparked national reform. The small commemorative plaque had been supplemented by a larger memorial garden dedicated to healthcare workers who had sacrificed for their patients. Sarah visited occasionally, though she preferred to focus on ongoing work rather than past recognition. St. Mary's General Hospital had been transformed from an understaffed public facility struggling with budget constraints into a model institution, showcasing best practices in healthcare worker support and patient advocacy. The federal funding that had followed the policy changes had enabled staffing improvements, equipment upgrades, and training programs that attracted medical professionals from across the region. Director Linda Thompson, who had terminated Sarah for violating hospital policies, now served as a national spokesperson for healthcare administration reform. Her conversion from policy enforcer to patient advocacy supporter illustrated the institutional culture change that had accompanied the legislative protections. She frequently spoke about learning to distinguish between necessary regulations and bureaucratic barriers that prevented optimal patient care. Tom Davis, the security guard who had first alerted Sarah to Mac's presence in the parking garage, had been promoted to Director of Community Outreach at St. Mary's, where his informal networks with Phoenix's homeless population had become formal partnerships, providing healthcare access to underserved communities. His role illustrated how recognizing and supporting existing compassionate practices could amplify their impact without requiring entirely new institutional structures. The financial impact of the healthcare reforms had exceeded all projections, with improved healthcare worker retention, reducing training costs, increased patient satisfaction, improving institutional reputations, and enhanced care quality, reducing liability expenses. The business case for supporting healthcare worker advocacy had become as compelling as the ethical arguments, creating sustainable institutional changes that didn't depend on continued political support. Sarah's personal transformation had been as dramatic as the policy changes she'd helped inspire. The federal salary and comprehensive benefits had eliminated the financial pressures that had characterized her hospital nursing career, while her new role provided intellectual challenges and professional growth opportunities that traditional nursing positions rarely offered. Most importantly, her work enabled her to influence healthcare delivery at scales that individual patient care couldn't achieve. Mac's journey from homelessness to national advocacy had provided him with purpose and stability that had been missing since his military discharge. The permanent housing, comprehensive health care, and meaningful employment had addressed the practical needs that homelessness had created, while his advocacy work had restored the sense of service that had motivated his original military enlistment. The friendship between Sarah and Mac had evolved into a professional partnership that continued to influence healthcare policy development. Their joint presentations combined clinical expertise with lived experience of systemic failures, providing perspectives that traditional policy development rarely incorporated. Their collaboration had become a model for involving affected communities in designing solutions to complex social problems. The ripple effects of their story had extended far beyond healthcare policy into broader discussions about individual responsibility, institutional accountability, and the potential for personal actions to drive social change. Business schools were using their case as an example of how individual ethical behavior could create organizational transformation. Political science programs were analyzing how personal narratives could influence policy development more effectively than traditional advocacy approaches. The second anniversary of the presidential announcement was commemorated with a White House ceremony recognizing the success of the Chen Healthcare Worker Protection Act. Sarah and Mac were joined by dozens of healthcare workers whose lives had been improved by the protections, veterans who had benefited from enhanced healthcare access, and policy officials who had implemented the reforms. The president's remarks focused on the ongoing nature of the changes that Sarah and Mac's story had initiated. The legislation was just the beginning of a cultural transformation that had made healthcare more humane for both providers and patients. The success of the reforms had created momentum for additional improvements in healthcare worker support, veteran services, and patient advocacy that continued to build on the foundation their encounter had established. Sarah's speech at the anniversary ceremony emphasized the collective nature of the achievements that had emerged from her individual decision to help Mac. Thousands of healthcare workers had courageously advocated for their patients once they knew they would be supported rather than punished. Hundreds of institutions had improved their practices once they understood that ethical behavior was good business as well as good medicine. Mac's remarks focused on the transformation that was possible when society honored service through effective support rather than symbolic recognition. The comprehensive assistance he'd received had enabled him to contribute meaningfully to improving systems that served other veterans. His journey from homelessness to advocacy illustrated the potential that could be realized when barriers to accessing earned benefits were removed. Dr. Mitchell's presentation detailed the measurable outcomes that had resulted from the policy changes, but his emphasis was on the cultural transformation that statistics couldn't fully capture. Healthcare workers were reporting higher job satisfaction, patients were experiencing better care quality, and institutions were discovering that supporting ethical behavior improved rather than threatened their operational effectiveness. The international delegations attending the anniversary ceremony represented growing global interest in replicating the American model of healthcare worker protection. Sarah and Mac's story had become part of international discussions about healthcare reform, professional ethics enforcement, and the role of individual narratives in driving policy change. The legacy of their encounter extended beyond the specific reforms it had inspired to encompass broader lessons about the potential for individual compassion to catalyze institutional change. Their story had demonstrated that ethical behavior could be systematically supported rather than accidentally punished, that personal narratives could drive policy development more effectively than abstract analysis, and that individual actions could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. As Sarah returned to her daily work developing healthcare policy guidelines, she carried with her the knowledge that every decision she made would affect the lives of healthcare workers and patients she would never meet. The responsibility was both humbling and inspiring, a constant reminder that individual choices could ripple outward in ways that transformed entire systems. Mac's evening routine still included reading about healthcare and veteran affairs developments, though now he was reading about programs he had helped create rather than systems that had failed him. The stability and purpose he had achieved enabled him to mentor other veterans navigating similar challenges, extending the cycle of support that had begun with Sarah's decision to provide medical care regardless of his ability to pay. The apartment, complex parking lot where their story had begun, remained a symbol of how extraordinary change could emerge from ordinary circumstances. The memorial garden attracted visitors who came to reflect on the potential for individual kindness to create lasting transformation, though Sarah and Mac both preferred that people focus on continuing the work rather than commemorating its origins. Their story had become part of American healthcare history, but their commitment remained focused on the daily work of improving systems that served vulnerable populations. The recognition and accolades were gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that healthcare workers across the country could advocate for their patients without fear, and veterans could access comprehensive care through streamlined systems that treated them with dignity. The transformation that had begun with a chance encounter in a hospital parking garage had evolved into sustainable institutional changes that honored both professional ethics and public service. Individual compassion had proven capable of catalyzing systemic reform, when supported by thoughtful policy development and sustained political commitment. As the second anniversary ceremony concluded and participants returned to their daily work, Sarah and Mac carried with them the knowledge that their story was still being written through the lives of every healthcare worker who advocated for a patient, every veteran who accessed needed care, and every individual who chose compassion over convenience in their professional and personal lives. The helicopter that had landed in Sarah's apartment complex had departed years earlier, but the changes it had announced continued to expand, touching lives in ways that no single policy intervention could have achieved. Their legacy lived on in improved healthcare systems, protected healthcare workers, and served veterans whose stories would never make national news, but whose lives had been transformed by the belief that individual kindness could change the world. 5 years after that pivotal December morning, when Sarah Chen first encountered Mac Rodriguez in a hospital parking garage, their individual acts of courage had blossomed into a nationwide movement that had fundamentally altered the landscape of American healthcare. The morning sun streamed through the expansive windows of the Sarah Chen Center for Healthcare Excellence in downtown Phoenix, illuminating the bustling activity of a medical facility that had been designed from the ground up to embody the principles of compassionate care and healthcare worker empowerment that had emerged from their extraordinary story. Sarah stood at the observation deck overlooking the main treatment floor, watching as dozens of medical professionals moved through their routines with a sense of purpose and dignity that had been largely absent from her own early nursing experience. The center operated under protocols that prioritized patient welfare while protecting healthcare workers who advocated for those in their care, creating an environment where ethical behavior was rewarded rather than punished, where compassion was institutionally supported rather than individually heroic. The facility's unique design reflected lessons learned from years of studying how physical environments could either support or hinder optimal healthcare delivery. Patient rooms were spacious enough to accommodate family members and care team. Consultations, waiting areas provided privacy for difficult conversations, and staff areas included dedicated spaces for the emotional processing that medical work inevitably required. Every architectural decision had been made with input from healthcare workers who understood the practical requirements of providing excellent care. Mac Rodriguez had arrived early for the day's anniversary ceremony, his role as national coordinator for veteran healthcare integration, requiring him to oversee the logistics of an event that would draw participants from across the country. His office in the center's administrative wing displayed photographs from medical facilities nationwide where veteran civilian healthcare coordination programs had been successfully implemented, each image representing lives improved through systematic rather than accidental support. The 5 years since the presidential helicopter had landed in Sarah's apartment complex had brought transformations that neither of them could have anticipated during their first encounter. Mac's journey from homelessness to national leadership had provided him with perspectives on healthcare delivery that traditional policy development rarely incorporated, while his continued residence in Phoenix kept him connected to the community where his recovery had begun. The veteran integration programs that Mac had helped design were now operating in medical facilities across all 50 states, reducing bureaucratic barriers that had prevented thousands of former service members from accessing timely health care. The success of these programs had attracted international attention, with military medical services from allied nations studying the American model for potential adaptation to their own veteran care systems. Dr. Mitchell had transitioned from government service to academic leadership, accepting the position of dean at the newly established National Institute for Healthcare Ethics, where his research focused on the intersection of individual moral behavior and institutional policy frameworks. His studies of the policy changes that had emerged from Sarah and Mac's story had contributed to a growing body of academic literature on how personal narratives could drive systematic social reform. The Institute's curriculum drew students from around the world who were interested in understanding how healthcare systems could be designed to support rather than constrain ethical behavior. Mitchell's courses on policy development used Sarah and Mac's case as a central example of how individual actions could catalyze institutional change when supported by thoughtful analysis and sustained political commitment. Sarah's morning began with rounds through the center's various departments, observing firsthand how the principles she'd helped develop were being implemented in daily medical practice. The emergency department operated under protocols that encouraged staff to advocate for patients regardless of their ability to pay, while comprehensive social services ensured that individuals like Mac would receive immediate assistance rather than being discharged to uncertain circumstances. The pediatric unit had become a showcase for family-centered care that involved parents as partners in treatment decisions, while supporting healthcare workers who identified systemic problems affecting child welfare. Nurses in the unit regularly consulted with administration about policy improvements, knowing that their clinical insights would be valued rather than dismissed as inconvenient observations. The Cancer Treatment Center embodied the philosophy that had emerged from Sarah's advocacy work, with patient navigators who helped families understand complex treatment options, while healthcare workers focused on providing optimal medical care without worrying about insurance authorization delays. The center's policy was to provide necessary treatment first and resolve payment issues later, ensuring that financial considerations never delayed potentially life-saving interventions. Mac's responsibilities included overseeing the center's Veteran Services Program, which had become a model for how civilian medical facilities could effectively serve former military personnel. The program addressed not only physical health needs, but also the psychological challenges of transitioning from military to civilian healthcare environments, recognizing that effective treatment required understanding the cultural context of military service. The program's success had attracted veterans from across the Southwest who traveled to Phoenix specifically to receive care in an environment that understood their unique needs. Mac's personal experience with both military medical care and civilian homelessness provided credibility with veteran patients who had grown skeptical of healthcare systems that seemed designed to frustrate rather than serve them. The anniversary ceremony drew attendees from across the spectrum of American healthcare, including nurses who had successfully advocated for patient safety improvements, physicians who had reported institutional problems without facing professional retaliation, administrators who had redesigned policies to support rather than constrain ethical behavior, and patients whose lives had been improved through systematic rather than accidental compassion. Sarah's keynote address to the assembled healthcare professionals focused on the evolution of their movement from individual advocacy to institutional transformation. She described how the protections that had emerged from her termination at St. Mary's had enabled thousands of healthcare workers to speak up about systemic problems, creating a culture where patient advocacy was professionally supported rather than personally risky. The audience included representatives from medical facilities that had implemented comprehensive healthcare worker protection programs, demonstrating measurable improvements in both staff satisfaction and patient outcomes. These institutions had discovered that supporting ethical behavior was not only morally correct, but also economically advantageous, as improved staff retention and enhanced care quality reduced operational costs while improving institutional reputations. Mac's presentation detailed the practical outcomes of veteran healthcare integration programs, using specific case studies to illustrate how systematic coordination between VA and civilian providers had improved care access and quality for former service members. His emphasis on dignity and respect in healthcare delivery resonated with audience members who had witnessed the dehumanizing effects of bureaucratic healthcare systems. The statistics Mac shared were impressive. Veteran homelessness rates had declined by 60% in areas where integration programs operated. Healthcare satisfaction scores among veteran patients had increased dramatically, and the time required to access mental health services had been reduced from months to days. More importantly, the cultural shift toward treating veterans as valued patients rather than bureaucratic challenges had improved outcomes across all measures of healthcare quality. Dr. Mitchell's academic research had documented the broader implications of the healthcare reforms that had emerged from Sarah and Mac's story. His longitudinal studies tracked improvements in healthcare worker job satisfaction, patient advocacy rates, and institutional compliance with ethical guidelines across facilities that had implemented protection programs. The data demonstrated that individual acts of moral courage could indeed catalyze systematic social change when supported by appropriate policy frameworks. The international dimension of their influence had expanded significantly, with delegations from European Union countries, Asian nations, and developing countries studying the American model of healthcare worker protection for potential adaptation to their own medical systems. Sarah had become a frequent speaker at international conferences, sharing insights about how individual narratives could drive policy development more effectively than traditional advocacy approaches. The World Health Organization had commissioned Sarah to develop global guidelines for protecting healthcare workers who prioritize patient welfare over institutional convenience, recognizing that the challenges she had faced at St. Mary's were common across healthcare systems worldwide. Her recommendations were being incorporated into international standards for medical ethics enforcement and healthcare worker support. Mac's work with international military medical services had focused on veteran transition programs that could be adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining core principles of dignity, respect, and comprehensive care. His presentations to NATO medical conferences had contributed to improved coordination between military and civilian healthcare systems across alliance nations. The personal relationship between Sarah and Mac had evolved into a professional partnership that continued to influence healthcare policy development at national and international levels. Their joint presentations combined clinical expertise with lived experience of systemic failures, providing perspectives that traditional policy development rarely incorporated. Their collaboration had become a model for involving affected communities in designing solutions to complex social problems. The financial sustainability of the reforms they had inspired was demonstrated through reduced healthcare worker turnover, improved patient satisfaction scores, decreased liability costs, and enhanced institutional reputations that attracted both talented staff and patient referrals. The business case for supporting healthcare worker advocacy had become as compelling as the ethical arguments, creating institutional changes that didn't depend on continued political support for their maintenance. Sarah's personal transformation from unemployed nurse to national healthcare leader had been accompanied by a renewed sense of purpose that went far beyond professional advancement. Her work enabled her to influence healthcare delivery at scales that individual patient care couldn't achieve, while her continued residence in Phoenix kept her connected to the community where her advocacy journey had begun. Mac's journey from homelessness to national prominence had provided him with stability and purpose that had been missing since his military discharge. But more importantly, it had enabled him to help other veterans avoid the bureaucratic obstacles that had complicated his own transition to civilian life. His advocacy work had restored the sense of service that had motivated his original military enlistment. The memorial garden at Sarah's former apartment complex had become a pilgrimage site for healthcare workers seeking inspiration for their own advocacy efforts, though both Sarah and Mac encouraged visitors to focus on continuing the work rather than commemorating its origins. The small plaque marking the helicopter landing site had been supplemented by a larger memorial honoring healthcare workers who had sacrificed for their patients. The ripple effects of their story continued to expand through the lives of every healthcare worker who advocated for a patient without fear of professional retaliation. Every veteran who accessed needed care through streamlined systems, and every individual who chose compassion over convenience in their professional and personal lives. Their legacy was measured not in the recognition they had received, but in the improved lives of people whose stories would never make national news. The evening celebration concluded with a candlelight vigil honoring healthcare workers who had died while serving their communities. Recognizing that the protections Sarah and Mac had helped establish were built on the sacrifices of countless medical professionals who had prioritized patient welfare despite personal cost. The ceremony served as both commemoration and commitment to continuing the work of creating healthcare systems worthy of the people they served. As participants dispersed to return to their daily work in medical facilities across the country, they carried with them renewed commitment to the principles that Sarah and Mac's encounter had helped establish. That healthcare should be guided by compassion rather than bureaucracy. That professional ethics should be supported rather than punished, and that individual acts of moral courage could catalyze systematic social transformation when sustained by collective commitment to change. The story that had begun with a chance encounter in a hospital parking garage had evolved into a movement that continued to shape American healthcare delivery, demonstrating that the most profound social changes often emerged from the simplest human interactions when guided by courage, sustained by commitment, and supported by communities willing to transform individual inspiration into institutional reality. Sarah and Mac's partnership in advocating for healthcare reform would continue as long as systems needed improvement and people needed care. Their shared commitment to dignity, compassion, and excellence serving as a foundation for ongoing work that honored both the promise of American healthcare and the dedication of those who provided it. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of how individual conscience could shape collective progress, proving that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges could indeed change the world through simple acts of extraordinary and kindness. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.